So before we kick off, you should see two buttons at the bottom of your screen where you can submit questions, the chat button and the Q&A button. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout, and we will have a dedicated time reserved at the end for Q&A. All right, next slide. We're excited to be joined by a broad group of our broker partners and policyholders today. We're proud to be the leading provider of cyber insurance and security solutions in the US and Canada. And as you'll see from today's presentation, we think about cyber risk differently, and we want to empower our customers to proactively take control over their cyber risk. We're going to address a few different topics today. We can switch slides, Aaron. First, we'll explain what we mean by remote access and the risks associated with it. Then we'll talk through our top 3 tips to set up secure remote access for your organization: secure passwords, data encryption, and multi-factor authentication. Finally, we'll reserve some time at the end for the dedicated Q&A that I spoke about. And with that, I'm very excited to hand it over to my colleague, Aaron.
Thank you, Marisa, and thank you everyone for joining us. Apologies for the slight technical hitch, but glad to be with you and hopefully help give some tips on how we can help you with remote access, making it more secure, understanding some of the risks versus the benefits and how we balance those. So I always like to start with a definition, making sure that we're on the same page. What is remote access? What we're talking about here is the ability for individuals to perform remote work, the ability to access their work data and work systems, whether that's email, collaboration tools, ticketing systems, IT administrative support functions, without being physically present in the office. And there are actually a number of drivers that are pushing remote work. Obviously, the biggest one, the shift to remote work last year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then, of course, our hybrid return to work strategies or partial return to work strategies that have some people in the office and some people out of the office. There are, however, some business and individual considerations that drive remote work. For example, many organizations have found during the pandemic, they were able to downsize on things like furniture, utility expenses, rent, particularly in large markets. Class A office space in Washington, DC, Vancouver, San Francisco, pretty expensive, giving people the ability to work remotely from anywhere, maybe only be in the office a few days each month, can definitely help save some costs. There are benefits to individuals and employees as well, and you're absolutely welcome to pin this one on me as a millennial. I appreciate my work-life balance. Many workers actually do. This is not just a millennial trend, but it was largely driven by the availability of remote access and tools, ubiquitous internet access being a great example. Simple fact is life does not happen only after 5 p.m. Work does not happen only between the hours of 9 to 5. Giving employees or staff members more flexibility actually has benefits for both organizations as well as the individuals. And finally, there are some bi-directional advantages as well. Organizations have found the ability to tap into a larger talent pool to be valuable. People don't necessarily want to live in expensive cities. They might want to live somewhere else close to their families. Having the ability to get those workers into your workforce without them being physically present in the same city obviously is an advantage. Again, to use myself as a personal example, I live on the East Coast of the US, but work with companies out on the West Coast. Tends to be more expensive to live there. Tends to be a little cheaper to live here. My family is here. In this case, both sides actually have some benefit. So I think remote access is here to stay, distributed work. From a security and risk standpoint, however, it's important to understand the shift that we've undergone. We have moved from a secure physical perimeter, everyone being in an office, having to show a badge to a receptionist or someone at a guard at the door, or having to swipe a badge or use a key to gain access. Previously, we used company-owned or company-managed hardware. You may have had a company-issued laptop and cell phone, and if you were in the office, you were on the company-managed network. So you were kind of shielded here, as you can see on the left. We've now moved to this more distributed model. We have what's known as bring your own device becoming more prevalent. BYOD is how that's shortened. We have people connecting from a whole bunch of different networks. We may have folks on a coffee shop Wi-Fi, for example, on their home network. They may be on the road and traveling, connecting from conference centers or hotels. They're accessing and managing data and executing business processes basically from anywhere. So with this shift, what are some of the risks? I don't want to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt. That's not the point of today's webinar. However, it is important to recognize that anything which offers a benefit could potentially also have some downsides. To underscore this point, nearly 1/3 of the claims that Coalition has seen, roughly 30%, are related to security incidents which in some way have remote access failures or abuse of remote access capabilities or tools as an underlying cause for the security incident. So definitely something to consider if you are going to support or move into a remote work model. Two big categories of risks that we'll be addressing today: cybersecurity and some physical and operational risks related to remote work. On the cybersecurity side, because we have remote access, we don't have everyone in the same building on the same network, we have to send data back and forth. There's a possibility for that data to be intercepted, lost, modified maliciously in transit. You may also have tools that are being used to provide remote access, things like Microsoft Remote Desktop Protocol, RDP, which are not inherently secure. RDP was designed for use within a network. You can use it across the internet. You should never use it across the internet if you don't take anything else away from this webinar. RDP on the public internet is a big no-no. It is possible, however, and when you have an IT staff looking at operational concerns, how do we get our entire staff up and running when they're no longer in the office? Some of these insecure connection methods may have snuck into your infrastructure. The other big cybersecurity risk related to distributed or remote work is the loss of control over data. You no longer have data within devices that you stored on devices that you control within your own office building. You have data stored outside of your control. This can be a problem in a number of ways. If data is compromised, you may not have the ability to do anything about it if it exists on someone's personal device. Saw a question in the chat, please clarify RDP. Not sure what kind of clarification. It means remote desktop protocol. It is a Microsoft technology, so Microsoft RDP, not related to Chrome or anything else. Some great questions: RDP with Remote Desktop Gateway or RD Web. All great questions. Those are more secure than RDP. Unfortunately, Microsoft has evolved this technology over a number of years, so there's quite a few acronyms. In general, anything that relies on Microsoft Remote Desktop from Coalition's security risk standpoint is too risky to have exposed to the internet. So we recommend other solutions for remote access, or if you do need to use RDP, putting it behind something like a VPN. The other bucket of risks related to remote work include physical and operational risks. So obviously, if people are working remotely, if they're on the go, they have these portable devices. That, of course, is very convenient. Unfortunately, it means they can also be quite easily stolen. So theft of mobile devices that contain data, pretty significant risk that we've seen. Operationally, there may be some additional costs related to remote work as well that you need to be aware of. If you have legacy on-premises applications, sometimes known as on-prem, you're opening up remote access to those. You have to pay licenses for those applications and then additional licenses for the VPN or remote connectivity software that you use to connect to it. And we'll talk about some solutions for that a little bit later on. From an operational standpoint, there might also be some barriers to collaboration. We'll talk about business process, everyone sitting together in a conference room, making a decision. Old way of doing things obviously worked when everyone could be in the office. If you have a distributed team, that type of collaboration process is not going to be as effective. So with these risks as a background, what are some of the ways that you can help to overcome them? Got 3 tips. Tip number 1 is securing passwords. Passwords, love them or hate them, they're here to stay. They are the keys to our digital kingdom, and there are some best practices that you can implement around password hygiene that can help make sure that those passwords remain secure. It's interesting, in the security community, we've actually had a relatively recent shift on guidance for what we call password hygiene, particularly related to how users create and manage their passwords. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the 8-character password. It needs a mix of uppercase and lowercase, special characters, and numbers. Unfortunately, what we've done is made passwords that are very difficult for people to remember, but very easy for computers to guess, and hackers know most of these already. So the latest guidance on password construction is actually that longer passphrases are preferred over shorter passwords, and less complexity is required. So instead of 8 characters with uppercase, lowercase, and special characters, an acceptable passphrase could be, "My favorite cake is Nutella buttercream." Why is that important? Well, number one, it's delicious, but more importantly, that's a phrase that's easy for a user to remember. And because that longer passphrase is harder for attackers to guess, it's also not a requirement that those passwords be changed as frequently. Some guidance says change only if the password has been compromised or if you believe it's been compromised. Other guidance gives you a little bit more flexibility to say, maybe change that password once every year. So instead of a user having to remember a new password every 30 days, they have a simple, easy to remember passphrase that they can use for an entire year. What hasn't changed in password hygiene guidance are the 3 cardinal rules of things you should never, ever, ever do with passwords. Writing them down, of course, is a no-no. Sharing them or reusing them across different applications or sites. Now, unfortunately, that does create some burden on users. They have to create a unique passphrase or unique password for each of the applications and websites that they log into. And that's where password managers can come in to make the lives of your users a little bit easier. A password manager is a software program that basically assists users in practicing good password hygiene. So it can do things like creating passwords when the users sign up for a new service. It can help the user to change the password if it's been compromised. Also takes the burden of having to remember and type in that password every time they log in, takes that off the user's plate, automates it with a piece of secure software. When you're looking at password managers for an organization, they should have a couple of key features. First and most importantly, they should offer centralized control. Someone within your organization should be able to control the password storage mechanism that your employees are using. So if someone leaves or is on vacation, if someone needs to be let go from the organization, an administrator should be able to revoke their access to sensitive business applications, sensitive systems, data, whatever the case may be. Password managers should also offer password suggestions. Again, you want to support your users practicing good password hygiene, and it's important to make sure that you choose a password manager that works across all of the devices that your users might be using. And this is particularly important when we talk about BYOD, where instead of a single corporate laptop configuration and corporate smartphone configuration, instead people are using a mix of personally owned devices, Android and iPhone, Mac and PC and Linux. We have some examples here of password managers that offer that kind of broad support and meet the other requirements here. LastPass and 1Password are both standalone products. They offer support across all of those different operating systems like Windows and Mac, as well as on smartphones. Another good password manager, if you happen to be all in on the Apple ecosystem, so all of your users have Macintosh devices or iPhones, iPads, the built-in iCloud keychain can also be a useful tool. One caveat there, it does not offer centralized management, but for many small businesses where maybe you only have 1 or 2 users, each user can manage their own iCloud keychain. Takes that burden of creating and remembering passwords off of the users, makes life a little bit easier, and costs nothing. It's free with the iCloud account that comes with the device you purchased. Brings us to tip number 2, which is encrypting the data. So we have all of the stuff that we're securing with passwords. Data encryption is a technology process. It basically puts the data behind a digital lock and gives you the ability to control who has access to the key. You actually need a key to decrypt data, the opposite of encrypting. Controlling who has access to that key by default by extension rather, gives you access, gives you the ability to control who has access to the data. When we talk about encryption, we talk about where it's going to be applied. Data exists in a variety of states. The two where encryption is most useful are data at rest and data in transit. Data at rest is basically data that is stored somewhere in a cloud service, on your hard drive. Large volumes of data can now be stored on smartphones, on laptops, again, because those can be easily stolen. Encrypting that data makes it harder for a thief who's gotten the physical device to actually read the data that's stored on it. Most cloud services offer some form of native encryption, so the data that you store in them is encrypted as you upload it or as you store it. You may also have the ability to apply some extra encryption. So you encrypt data before it is stored on the cloud service provider. The cloud service provider also does some encryption. You basically have two layers of control there in case a piece of hardware is stolen. In case there is a data breach, all they get is completely unusable encrypted data. Data at rest encryption is also supported, but not always turned on by default across a variety of popular devices. So both Windows and Mac operating systems support encryption of all the data stored on the hard drive inside your computer. Most of the modern smartphone platforms, Android and iOS, enforce encryption automatically. So you don't really necessarily need to set it up there. For your desktops or laptops, might be worth looking into making sure that that's properly configured. The other important data state to keep in mind is data in transit. As the name implies, this is data moving from one place to another, from a user's laptop to a web server, to a cloud service, to another recipient's email inbox. While that data is moving from one place to another, it is obviously at risk. Most data in transit goes across the internet, and I cannot stress this enough, the internet is not a secure communications medium. By default, most internet services allow data to be read by anyone who can intercept it. So you need to make sure that you're properly applying encryption so that that data, as it's moving from point A to point B, again, even if it gets intercepted, it's unintelligible to the person who has intercepted it. Most of your cloud and web apps actually support encryption natively. There's nothing required for you to configure here. Uses a technology known as TLS. To put it very simply for the non-tech folks, when you log into a secure website and you see that little lock icon up in your address bar, that is a website or a web application that supports encryption. The data moving between your computer and that remote server that is providing you access to that application, it's being secured in transit. It's being encrypted before it's sent across the internet. If you are building your own BYO applications, if you are creating web apps or creating internal applications that users are going to be logging into, you will need to make sure that you've properly configured them to support the encryption needs. All of this, of course, should be based on the value of the data. If you're dealing with healthcare information, if you're dealing with payment card information, any kind of sensitive data, you definitely want to make sure you have encryption. You may also have some legal, regulatory, or compliance obligations that force you to put encryption in place. Not going to go into too much of the technical details about how you do that. One of the key things that underpins modern web app encryption are what are known as digital certificates. If you have an IT team, if you have developers, those folks should be able to help you out with this. Making sure that you use a trusted digital certificate issuer is going to be important. One of the things that Coalition often sees are these digital certificates, which are the foundation of this data in transit encryption, which have expired. They're no longer valid, so users connecting to a website can't really be sure that their data is going to be secure. Lots of digital certificate issuers, lots of options for getting these. If you are looking for a low-cost option, let'sencrypt.org is a good free option that lets you install a digital certificate on your web applications, helps you by automating the renewal process so those certificates never expire, and lets you implement security in a relatively easy and, again, low-cost manner. So great for those small business concerns. Tip number 3, and this is something that I will say over and over and over again, but multi-factor authentication is such a huge win from a security standpoint that it bears repeating. 3 key questions to ask, or to answer rather, about multi-factor authentication. What is it? Where should it be? and why is it valuable? Multi-factor authentication is something that you use when you log in, when you authenticate, when you prove an identity to a system or to a service. Your identity is typically your username. You prove that you are who you say you are by providing some sort of credentials, a password, presenting an ID badge, maybe plugging in a smart card, or a secure USB key. Those are all factors of authentication. And there are three types of factors. You can have knowledge factors, something like a password or a PIN that you know. Factors that involve possession, a device that you physically have, a key fob that generates a code, a trusted smartphone that has an authenticator app on it. And the third type of factor is measurement of a biological characteristic, fancy way of saying biometrics. These are things like fingerprint scans, facial scans, Touch ID or Face ID on an iPhone, fingerprint readers on Google and Samsung phones. Multi-factor authentication, pretty simple, basically combines more than one of these factors. So when you log into an application and you have to provide both a fingerprint and a PIN or a password plus a code generated by an authenticator app, you're providing more than one factor. With that definition, where should you apply multi-factor authentication? Everywhere that it is supported, and I emphasize this, I am not joking, I do mean this. Literally anywhere and everywhere you can implement multi-factor authentication, you should implement it. Got some examples here from a business standpoint, any of your email and collaboration tools. Many mobile devices support multi-factor authentication. And similar to when we talked about data at rest encryption, they support it without any additional work required. So for anyone who's ever restarted an Android or an iPhone that has a fingerprint reader, you know that you have to type in your passcode at least once before you can use it. That's actually an example of multi-factor authentication, and it's built right into the device. There's nothing required for you to do. You can do the same thing on both Windows and Mac laptops using facial recognition or fingerprint readers that are built into those devices. And again, enabling it anywhere that you possibly can or making use of it where it's available is our recommendation. From a business standpoint, any cloud or web apps, particularly those that have sensitive data or have sensitive business value to you, anything that is something that you could not live without as an organization should be under consideration for multi-factor authentication. And an emerging sort of bleeding edge recommendation in security is encouraging employees or staff members to implement multi-factor authentication even for personal accounts. Now, this should be separate, of course, from work accounts, but just as a general best practice for anything that you share information with. Many banking websites offer this, social networks like LinkedIn or Instagram, anywhere that it can be implemented, again, recommendation is to do so. From Coalition's claims experience from security incidents which have been reported to us, we have actually seen compromises where individual employees were targeted rather than, and the attackers, instead of targeting them directly on their business email or through business networks, instead infiltrated personal networks, got information about them, and then used that information to target the business. In fact, the LinkedIn attack back in 2013 did exactly this. An engineer's LinkedIn profile was actually taken over. Information about that employee was used to gather information about other employees who were then targeted, and ultimately LinkedIn suffered a breach of usernames and passwords. So why is all of this important? What value does multi-factor authentication offer? We've made very, very secure systems. It's very difficult to do what you see in the movies where somebody sits in front of a screen and just types in a bunch of characters and hacks the Pentagon. At this point, the easiest way to attack a target is to actually steal credentials. We talk about phishing all the time, literally phishing for somebody to give up the keys needed to gain access to sensitive resources. Multi-factor authentication makes those types of attacks much, much harder. It increases the work that an attacker has to perform. It seems pretty obvious. They have to steal more stuff. It's not just username and password that needs to be stolen. It's username and password, and you have to steal a user's personal device where they have an authenticator app. You have to figure out how to break into that device to get the 6-digit code from that app to put in when you try to log in. So if we can make the attackers' lives harder, that's a win. Of course, when we talk about security controls, these can occasionally create more work for our users. They can create frustration. So we always try to strike a balance. The good news is multi-factor authentication is fairly lightweight from a user standpoint. It doesn't increase friction. You don't have to do a whole lot of extra work when you log in, and it's also relatively simple to implement. It is an emerging security best practice, so most common software providers support multi-factor authentication. The big office collaboration platforms, Microsoft 365, Google Workspace, they all support this natively. So it's easy, simple, and in many cases free to implement, part of the service that you're already paying for. I know I'm giving you a lot of rules. I don't like to follow rules myself, so I'm throwing in a bonus tip here. I know we said that we have 3, but our bonus tip is not necessarily focused on cybersecurity so much as it is on business process and mindset, embracing this idea or mindset of remote or distributed work. Key takeaway here, think about making remote work or making a distributed team structure a native part of your business processes and not an afterthought. Talked about the potential for double paying for both application licenses and then VPN licenses needed to access them. Think about whether you could adapt and migrate both your system needs as well as your business processes to a cloud-first distributed model that does away with the need to do that duplicate license purchase. There are some advantages as well. We talk about barriers to collaboration with remote work. If everyone needs to be in a meeting looking at a projected set of numbers, in order to make decisions, obviously, if someone is out sick or on vacation, they can't participate in that. A distributed system where information is shared asynchronously, something like Slack, or maybe you have some kind of dashboard software where information is available to all users when, where, and how they need it, that can actually support making your business more agile. Instead of waiting for people to get back from vacation to make decisions, they can actually log in, weigh in with their 2 cents whenever they get back from vacation. You don't have to wait until next week's team meeting to make that. Final thought, I think that speaks to some of the return on investment. Can you as an organization become more agile, become more nimble or lean? There are also some key advantages from a finance perspective when we talk about these cloud-first and distributed systems. Purchasing IT hardware and software is a capital expenditure from a tax and accounting perspective, not preferable. Purchasing IT services in a cloud model is an operating expenditure. So that's where we get these terms CapEx versus OpEx. Many organizations' cloud strategy, the driver for them to adopt cloud services, was this ability to shift their spending from capital expenditures to operating expenditures, which in many cases can reduce taxable income. So there are some pretty obvious advantages from a business standpoint as well. These tips track with the guidance that is in Coalition's free cybersecurity guide. We cover not only these topics, but also several others, including the technical implementation details around multi-factor authentication and secure remote access, endpoint detection and response and anti-malware, as well as the importance of things like patch management. So you're welcome to download that guide. You can find it here, coalitioninc.com/cybersecurity-guide for more tips, tricks, and hopefully some useful information.
All right, now we're going to open it up for some Q&A. I have one question for you, Aaron, clarifying questions about RDP. Is RDP safe if used with a VPN? And what about if it's used with multi-factor authentication or MFA?
Great questions. The answer, unfortunately, as in many things in life, will be it depends. If you have a secure VPN, using RDP or any of the Microsoft remote desktop technologies over the VPN, I would give that a thumbs up. Using no name Bob's VPN service that no one's ever heard of to secure access to your environment, not a great security recommendation there. So a trusted, reputable VPN plus RDP, again, I'd give that a thumbs up. RDP with two-factor authentication is an interesting beast. It's better than only using a username and password. However, because remote desktop, the underlying sort of protocols and technology were never designed for being never designed to be accessible over the public internet. There have been a number of attacks against remote desktop technologies where two-factor authentication would not have been sufficient to protect an organization. So there's a type of attack known as a remote code execution. Basically, I send some software code to a remote server. The remote server takes that and runs with it, similar to double-clicking an application on your computer and opening it up to run with it. Obviously, if you can trick a server into running software, you can do a whole number of things. And many of those remote code executions were designed to give an attacker administrative access to a remote host, basically create an admin account that that attacker controlled. In that case, two-factor authentication does absolutely nothing. The exposed, insecure remote desktop service was the target of the attack, not necessarily the user accounts. So very long way of saying better than nothing, but still not a best practice.
Great information. Another question, can you highlight any potential vulnerabilities with intranet web apps on an internal secured network?
Where to start there? I think one of the biggest, of course, would be data in transit, because the data has to go from an internal server to a user's workstation. Depending on how your network has been set up, that data could be broadcast to people who are not authorized to see it. You can still have a data breach, even if someone who works for you, even if the people who gained access to data are folks who work from you, not necessarily folks outside the organization. So if you have an internal HR app with social security numbers or social insurance numbers, if that data is moving around your internal network unencrypted, anyone who can see that, typically outside HR, not authorized to see it, that still counts as a data breach. There may still be the potential for fines or issues. So I would almost say there's really no difference between security for an intranet web app versus an internet-facing one. I would apply the same level of rigor in terms of defining requirements. Obviously, in terms of spending, if you have some security controls like a secure perimeter, I see mention of an air-gapped network, I'm not going to spend quite as much securing that intranet application. For anyone not familiar, air gapping simply refers to a network that is physically not connected to another one. So if you have an office building that has an intranet, so computers inside the building can talk to each other, but they are not connected to the outside world, to the intranet, to the internet, that is an air-gapped network.
Okay, great. So before we wrap up, I want to again point you to our 2021 cybersecurity guide. This is where you can access information along with other top recommendations to keep your organization secure. We will also be sending this out following the presentation, along with the recording of the webinar. And we want to thank you again for taking time out of your day to learn more about secure remote access. Our contact info is on the next slide. Our team is available 24/7 through our help email and emergency line. And we hope that you have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you all, and thanks, Marisa, for hosting.